All right, so today we are looking at the Nintendo Switch 2 and the Steam Deck. We couldn't have picked two very different devices, but two devices that are also kind of similar in more ways than you might think. So let's dive deep into this. And if you are new here, my name is Arnell, the comic book gamer. And if you want to stay plugged into all things Nintendo and all things Steam, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss another video like this. So both of these devices are fantastic handheld devices. Now, they are completely different ecosystems, and you can't try to cross-shop these. Even though the Steam Deck can do some similar things that the Switch can do, you can't really compare these two and overlap them to think about, playing a particular game on both consoles, even though there are some games that are cross-platform that you can certainly play on both consoles. That's not really the purpose of these two devices. They are very different, and they are intended for very different audiences. So let's start with the Switch 2. So the Switch 2 is obviously very geared towards families. Now, the Switch 2 gives you a lot of versatility in the docked mode, handheld mode, of course, the tablet mode with just setting it down on a table and then using the Joy-Cons in your hands. You have a ton of different ways that you can play the Switch 2, and the games themselves are all, Nintendo games. At least the first-party games are Nintendo games. Your stuff like Mario, Donkey Kong, Kirby, all that kind of stuff. Now, of course, you have third-party games, and you're going to see a lot more third-party support with the Switch 2. Notably, things like Cyberpunk 2077, a From Software exclusive in the Duskbloods, and just a bunch of other third-party games that you never would have thought would be able to be played on a Switch, but now on a Switch 2, you actually have access to them, and the ports are relatively really good, all things considered. Now, the handheld form factor is where you're going to see a little bit of a difference between how the Switch 2 just feels in hand versus the Steam Deck. The Switch 2 is, I've said it before, but it's like the Nintendo Switch is like almost not made for the human hand because it is just completely not ergonomic, and the complete, flat feeling of the Joy-Cons and the tablet itself in your hand is just, it's not fun to hold. It's not a good time. For me, I can at most play in handheld mode for like 30 minutes to an hour at most, which for some people isn't bad, especially if you do quick spurts of gaming, but it's just not the most, portable device that you can just comfortably play and, continue to play for a long period of time, at least in my case. Now, there are some people that absolutely swear by the Switch's portability and the handheld mode and everything like that, and that's great. For me, I've found it's just not the ergonomic powerhouse that some people claim it to be. Now, one improvement that the Switch 2 has over the Steam Deck is the 1080p screen. So yeah, the Switch 2 actually has a beautiful, vibrant HDR screen that does a fantastic job of producing beautiful colors and everything like that. And if you're comparing it to like a base LCD Steam Deck, well, you're actually going to see a much better resolution on the Switch 2 versus the 800p resolution on the Steam Deck. So you're going to have a much better experience on the Switch 2 versus the Steam Deck. Now, if you're looking at the OLED Steam Deck, which is a lot more expensive, then of course you're going to have literally a factually much better screen given the darker darks and the brighter whites and everything like that. So you're going to have a much more, cohesive and just proper experience on the OLED Steam Deck. But again, the Switch 2 is still very good, and it holds its own weight very well. Now, the Switch 2 does have some differences in the just overall game catalog. So I've mentioned it before, but the Switch 2 is where you're going to get the first-party Nintendo games. And really, legally, is the only way that you can play Nintendo games. They cannot, you can't play Mario on a PlayStation. You can't play Mario on an Xbox. You can't play Mario on PC. You can only play Mario legally on the Switch. And so that is something to keep in mind, especially if you're somebody that is, really particular about wanting to make sure you're just playing a game, right? You don't want to accidentally, fall into the wrong hands and, end up getting a, copy of a game that you're trying to get, and it's, first of all, not legal, but also could have some potential viruses coming with it and stuff like that. So just some things that you might want to potentially think about is that really, if you really care about, Mario games, Pokemon games, all of the other sort of first-party games that you really can only play on Nintendo, then the Nintendo is the only place to do that because you just cannot do that anywhere else legally. which is a bit of a double-edged sword because the Nintendo platform is the only place to be able to play these Nintendo games. And in some cases, and in many cases, you don't really get the same level of third party support across the board. Now, I've said it before, but the Switch 2 does have, better third party support this time around versus the Switch 1 and just previous Nintendo consoles. So I do anticipate, if a game is going to be made for PS5 and Xbox, then it is pretty well certain that you could expect some sort of a port, maybe not day one, but some sort of a port on the Switch 2, which is very good because you couldn't really rely on that on the original Nintendo Switch. Now, before I switch gears and talk about the Steam Deck, I do want to remind you that if you're finding value in this video and if you like more things gaming related, please make sure you hit the subscribe button down below and drop a like down below as well. That lets me know you want to see more videos like this. And yeah, let's just get right back into it. Okay, so the Steam Deck is, again, a very different device to the Nintendo Switch 2, but also similar in some ways. Let's start with the similarities. So the Steam Deck actually gives you the flexibility and the same level of options that you can play with the Switch. And you can do that all virtually the same way with the Steam Deck. So, of course, you can obviously play handheld, and I will touch more on the handheld, portion of that a little bit later in the video, but you can play, your games handheld just right in your hand. You can also dock it and play it on a TV or a computer monitor. You can also play it on sort of a tabletop mode, especially if you have a case like the one that I have from Skull & Co., which just allows me to prop the device up without any kind of kickstand or anything like that. So I can prop up my Steam Deck right on the table and connect a wireless controller and just play in tabletop mode just like that as well. So you have a ton of different ways, plus some extra ways like being able to do, mouse and keyboard input and things like that. So there's a lot of different accessibility options and a wide range of ways to be able to play however you want to. Now, depending on the dock that you use for the Steam Deck will kind of determine your overall experience with trying to play on the TV or a monitor, because in my case, I've found something like the jsaux Steam Deck dock to be a better dock than the much more expensive Valve dock, officially from the company that created the Steam Deck. So personally, I have a better experience with something cheaper like that, but depending on whatever your docking situation is, you'll actually find that your mileage may vary because some docks don't really perform the best and the same way as other docks. Whereas with the Switch 2, there's really just one option. I mean, of course, there's third-party docks. You can use any kind of USB-C dock that you want, but for the Switch 2 that comes with the official Nintendo Switch dock, well, you're going to have a very seamless and fantastic experience that is very reliable and just straight to the point every single time. Now, with the Steam Deck, I do need to touch on the ergonomics because, like I said with the Switch 2, it's like it wasn't even made for the human hand, whereas the Steam Deck is extremely comfortable. It has very beefy sides to it that just your fingers just naturally hug around the edges of it, and for me personally, the thumbsticks at the top of the device just being nice and even like that versus the asymmetrical layout of like Pro controllers and Xbox controllers and stuff like that. Personally, I really appreciate how the Steam Deck performs in just the overall ergonomics department. It is the best feeling handheld device that I've personally ever held, and I have a ton of different options to choose from, like the G Cloud, the Portal, and a bunch of other ones. So for me, the Steam Deck is just the most comfortable thing to play. So if you're somebody that enjoys playing handheld, well, the Steam Deck is really virtually unbeatable, at least in my opinion. But what if you like to play docked and you really don't care about how it feels in the hand? Well, as long as you have a good dock, which for me, the jsaux dock has been great. I'll have an affiliate link down below if you want to check that out for yourself. But the docking experience can be just as seamless. So literally with just one USB-C connection right at the top, I am able to just play, right on my monitor just fine, especially with this jsaux dock as well. It has a fan built into it with a lot of cool RGBs and stuff like that. But if you don't care for the RGBs, you can turn them off. But the fan really helps to cool down the Steam Deck so that way I can have, good peak performance all the way through my gaming session. Not to mention all of the peripherals that I can add to it, whether it be a, wireless headset with a dongle for low latency, no latency at all, or a mouse and keyboard for that input as well. So there's a lot of different options that I can do, and obviously, your Ethernet and stuff like that. So it's just great having a good docked experience that as long as you have the right dock, then you're able to have just as seamless and good of an experience on whatever monitor that you want to use it on. Now, touching into the games library, well, the games library is where you're going to see the biggest difference between the two, and the Steam Deck is just massive. The amount of games that you can access on Steam are just phenomenal. And that's really because of what the Steam Deck is at the end of the day. So, not only is it a handheld gaming device, it's also a PC. And with that PC functionality of it, you of course get your desktop mode and stuff like that, but maybe you don't really care about that. The PC gaming aspect of it allows you to play virtually any PC game from, 10, 20, 30 years ago, as long as it's on the Steam store and it's either rated as verified to work with the deck, or it's rated as playable, or it's just overall just, a decent running game. Maybe it's not a very graphically intensive game or something like that. You have a huge array of games that you can choose from and a huge array of options that are just virtually endless. I mean, obviously there is a number at the end of it, but you get what I'm saying. It's going to be massively a much bigger library than what you can get on the Switch or the Switch 2. The Switch 2 can only play either the current console games or the past generation, and so you're kind of obviously limited from that aspect. Now, it's not to say that there's not very many games on the Switch. There's a ton, but you are also kind of limited in the ecosystem of what kind of games you want to play. So if you're somebody that plays more hardcore games, like, I don't know, Call of Duty or stuff like that, the Switch 2 isn't the place to do that. You literally can't. And so, that might change down the road with, future Call of Duties and stuff like that, especially with the Switch 2 being more, powerful and everything like that. But if you want to play an older Call of Duty game on the Steam Deck, then you certainly can. If you want to play, more intensive games, I don't know, like Red Dead Redemption 2 and have, beautiful graphical fidelity on that, you certainly can. If you want to play Cyberpunk 2077 in again, beautiful graphical fidelity, then you can certainly do that on the Steam Deck. And a better port, a better version of it on the Steam Deck versus the Switch 2 version that just is great that you can play Cyberpunk 2077, but it's not quite the same level of quality as what you would get in the Steam Deck version of it, or just the PC version of it. And so having access to all of these games and all of these different genres and things, plus the indie games that you have in the Steam store, again, not to say that, the Switch eShop doesn't have indie games. There certainly are a ton of them, but there's just such a wide array of different options and genres to choose from that you just have so much more available to you on the Steam Deck. And if you're not interested in all of those options, but maybe there's a handful of games that you either remember from your childhood or whatever is the case that aren't Nintendo games, then you can pretty well run those just fine on the Steam Deck. And a lot of the Steam sales as well, that's a huge point in and of itself. The Steam sales are just insane, and there's usually one really nice sale going on at any given time during the month, which is just great. And then there's of course your spring sales, your summer sales, your winter sales for the whole season that seem to be where you're going to see the biggest discounts and things like that. So you're going to have access to a ton of different games. That's really going to elevate your gaming experience depending on whatever game you want to play. Now, one thing that I will say for the Switch 2 that it has over the Steam Deck is the physical aspect of the game. So if you're somebody that really enjoys physical games, having physical copies of games and things like that, either lining up your shelf or just knowing that you can play a game directly on the, cart itself, well, the Switch 2 has access to that with the Switch 1 games. Obviously, with their virtual game card, system now, that's totally a different system than what it was with the Switch 1. But of course, you at least have your physical aspect to either just having a game case, even though the card itself might not actually have the game on it, but you at least have the physical aspect of it if you're somebody that enjoys that. Or with the Switch 1 case, then you're able to actually play those Switch 1 games directly on the cart without an internet connection or anything like that. So you do have that aspect of it, whereas with the Steam Deck, everything is digital, which has its pros and cons. I do mention this in the past that personally, I'm kind of right in the middle between physical and digital. Physical definitely has its advantages in certain areas. Digital also has its advantages in certain areas too. We can kind of go down that rabbit hole if we really want to. But one thing to know, especially with the Steam Deck, that some people may not know is that even though you are, having these digital games, you're paying for them and everything like that. Technically, Steam is only giving you the license to access the game. So you don't actually own the games in your Steam library. Say it ain't so. But that is just something to maybe keep in mind if you're somebody that, really enjoys just ownership of the things that you are using and things like that. Just, food for thought. But as we're kind of winding down, let's discuss what I really think of the Switch 2 and the Steam Deck. Again, these are two very different devices, but they serve very similar purposes and they do very similar things. Honestly, at the end of the day, and this isn't a cop-out answer, is one better than the other? For me, no. They serve two very different things in terms of the Switch 2 being my sort of family device. We love playing Mario Kart World, really the only launch game that is, worth playing, in my opinion. That's something that is new. But Mario Kart World is just a fantastic game to be able to play with the family, along with all of the other, Nintendo games as well. Super Mario Odyssey is a game that was a launch game for the original Nintendo Switch that I am still playing to this day. And so, yeah, there's the family aspect of the Switch 2 that I really value and appreciate. But then for me personally, the Steam Deck just really holds a candle of its own in the performance of being able to play, really more graphically intensive games and more, demanding games on the device itself, while also being an extremely comfortable device and extremely versatile. I can stream my PlayStation 5. I can play Xbox Game Pass on there. I can use it like a PC if I really need to with the desktop mode, and I can just browse the web, do, write out scripts for videos, write in Google Docs. I can do a whole plethora of things. So there's a ton of different things that I can do with the Steam Deck that I just can't ever imagine possibly doing with the Switch 2. So there's a totally different market for what the Steam Deck can do versus the Switch 2. And at the end of the day, it all depends on what you really value in your gaming sessions. Do you enjoy playing with other people and being able to, do couch co-op and stuff like that? Well, the Switch 2 is more of the console for you. Or if you're somebody that really plays handheld and you want access to, games from 15, 20 years ago that are non-Nintendo games, maybe you're not even a fan of Nintendo games themselves, then the Steam Deck is the route to go. There's also the aspect of the company itself. The company of just the Switch 2, obviously being Nintendo, they've made some decisions and choices lately that I am just not super fond of, that aren't very consumer friendly. Whereas Steam Deck is just hailed as Valve themselves are just a fantastic group of people that just, if you ever have any issues, they are right there, ready and willing to do above and beyond and even past that to make sure that you are satisfied in your overall experience. And they have paved the way for showing what true customer service in the gaming industry is like. So that is a company that you really want to support, because we all need Steam, we all need Valve, and the Steam Deck is the physical embodiment of them, delivering a physical device that you're able to actually interact with. So at the end of the day, which one is right for you? That's what I want to know down below in the comments. And if you're curious on my thoughts on the Steam Deck a little bit more, or the Switch 2 a little bit more, definitely check out either one of these videos, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.